Welcome to our public lecture series. Today we're very happy to have Chris Bavitz, who's going to speak on copyright. I'll give you just a few words about our introduction. He's the Wilmar Hale Clinical Professor of Law at Harvard University, Harvard Law School, where he co-teaches the Counseling and Legal Strategy in the Digital Age seminar and teaches in the seminar Music and Digital Media. I'll skip the rest of his rather impressive bio to conclude with he received a BA cum laude from Tufts and then a JD from the University of Michigan Law School in 1998 and has been at Harvard for how long?
In various capacities for about 9 years, and then on the faculty for the last 3. So,
well, very kind of him to share his time today.
Great.
And
thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Colin. Thanks all of you for coming. We'll see how this, see if we can make this work. So great, as Jerry said, my primary thing I do at Harvard Law School these days is run our clinical program, our technology law clinical program, which is one of a significant number of clinics that we have at Harvard. Ours is called the Cyber Law Clinic, and we basically have students enrolled for credit doing legal work for real-world clients. And I first met Colin when he used to work for Cambridge Community Television across the river here, which has been a long-time client of ours. Basic model is the students do the work, supervisors like myself teach them in the classroom and also kind of supervise their work for clients and make sure no one's committing legal malpractice, and the clients get the free legal services, and students get sort of real-world practice experience, which is great. I also teach a class called Music and Digital Media, and I have a long background, I think, before I came to HLS in law practice in music and music tech, so this is a subject that's still near and dear to my heart, and when I was asked what I might want to speak about today, I thought of this one in part because I think it has a very strong, and this surprises some people, the sort of information sciences component to it, in that some of the hottest topics of discussion in sort of music law and policy today are actually around data and metadata, and about trying to help both commercial actors as well as archivists and librarians deal with incredible complexity in the licensing landscape. So I think what I'm going to try and do today is do a little bit of Copyright 101 quickly to orient us to a couple of key points, talk about a few things that I think are interesting that you may run across if you're reading in the newspaper, reading online about the issues that are going on with Spotify and iTunes and that kind of thing, and then conclude with this conversation about data and metadata, which is, again, a very hot topic right now. So we'll kind of come back to that. So when I try and do copyright law in 5 minutes, which is what I'm going to try and do today, I usually focus on sort of 3 parts of the Copyright Act, and needless to say, there are semester-long courses that can be taught on this topic. But the first is Section 102 of our Copyright Act in the US, and I should say at the outset, copyright law is a federal body of law in the United States. The reason why it's a federal body of law is that actually our US Constitution says that among the very narrow, limited things that our Congress is supposed to do, like wage war and print currency and do those sorts of things, one of the things it's supposed to do is to pass laws that promote the progress of science and useful arts. So there's actually sort of an incentivization mechanism built into the Constitution to tell Congress to pass copyright law, pass patent law, to ostensibly incentivize, encourage people to make creative things. We could have hours-long discussion about whether our statute actually does that. I think there are lots of people who pointed out that incentives don't really work that way. If you're a creative person, you don't necessarily wake up in the morning and say, what is the Copyright Act going to give me in exchange for sitting down today and writing my symphony? What rights will I get? Not quite how it works, but that's sort of the background about all of this. So I would say if we're talking about music, and if you take nothing else from our conversation today, it's this. The 2 things to keep in mind are, that the thing to keep in mind is that there are 2 separate bundles of rights in any piece of recorded music. And if you're going out and, again, creating a musical archive, or trying to license a piece of music to use in a film, or trying to create the next Spotify, you have to bear in mind that number 2, music works, is musical compositions. Number 7, sound recordings, has to do with particular recorded versions of those compositions. And again, these are the 2 that we will focus on throughout the course of a music and digital media class, and certainly in this conversation. And again, anytime you're thinking about use of a musical work, keep in mind there are actually 2 sets of rights at issue there. Musical works are songs, right? It's a composition that we could do any number of separate recordings of. A Beethoven symphony, for example, is a musical composition. It is old enough now to be in the public domain. There are no copyright issues with using a Beethoven musical composition, but we could each make a separate recording of a Beethoven composition, or for that matter, a Beatles song like Paul McCartney and John Lennon, and in any of those cases, we would have a single musical work, multiple sound recordings. Again, a sound recording is a particular fixation, a particular embodiment of that musical work. You could have multiple takes. Oftentimes you'll get a jazz record that's a reissue that has all of the different versions that the people in the studio played that day of the song. Those are separate sound recordings. And again, if you take nothing else from this today, I think it's this distinction, which is if someone says to you, let's think about what rights we need in this musical work, step back and say there's two bundles there, we got to think about both of them. There's a songwriter on one side and there's someone who owns rights in a sound recording on the other. So we have that list of the kinds of kinds of copyrighted works that are protected. Section 106 of the Act talks about the things you can do with those works. And again, we're not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but number one, an obvious one, is make copies of it. So if you own a work that is protectable, a literary work or a musical composition or a sound recording, you have the exclusive right to copy it, to prepare derivative works of it, to distribute copies to others, that sort of thing. So this is key, and again, one of the things I think to keep in mind about this is that if you are an owner of a copyright, you can license people to do these separate people to do these different things. I might license you to distribute it, and I could license you the right to make a derivative work. We were talking earlier about samples. You could sample my sound recording that might be making a derivative work. If you're the copyright owner, you have all of these sorts of bundles of rights. In general, if I own rights in a particular work, here we're talking about musical works, and you violate one of these, I have not given you the right to distribute copies, and you distribute copies, you have infringed my copyright. An important key kind of caveat to the doctrine of infringement, is the last thing we'll talk about, which is fair use. So we have the types of works that are protected, the kinds of rights we have in those works, and fair use, very important to librarians, archivists, and many others who make use of copyrighted works. Fair use says that for certain limited purposes, you may actually use someone else's copyrighted work in a way that would otherwise be protected by copyright, would otherwise be an infringement. But in certain cases, that use is fair, and the Act sets out 4 factors. And again, we can have a semester-long class about fair use, which is a really fun topic, and I think a really interesting one about, again, the situations in which it is okay to use someone else's copyrighted work without requesting their permission in a way that you're legally permitted to do. And again, some of these have been very heavily litigated, including in particular Factor 1 and Factor 4, which I think it's fair to say most would say are the kind of the key factors. The first is the purpose and character of your use. How are you making use of that work? If you're doing something non-commercial or educational, you are more likely to be a fair user than if you're doing something purely commercial. If you're having very little effect on the market for the underlying work, you're more likely to be a fair user. If, on the other hand, you're making perfect, pristine copies to sell in competition with the existing work, you're probably not a fair user. Again, very high level. So let's talk about sort of, like I said, the 4 or 5 of these kind of hot topics, and these are things that I think you probably hear a lot about in popular media. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about the internet era, and particularly the last 2 decades, is that copyright issues that used to be very niche and used to be thought about by sort of pointy-headed law professors at law schools are now front and center, because whether we like it or not, we are interacting with the copyright system every day. I probably at various times today, whether or not you know it, you have granted a copyright license to someone. If you dragged and dropped a photo into your Facebook to post for someone, you have granted Facebook a license to use it under terms of use. So we interact with copyright quite regularly today in ways that I don't think was true sort of pre-internet. So the first hot topic I'll mention, again specific to music, has to do with this topic of fair use. It really has to do with protections for sound recordings. And I guess I would say we have seen a lot of action in the last couple of decades around fair use that I think it's fair to say broadens the definition of things that you can do fairly with other people's copyrighted works. I put this up on the screen. These are the lyrics to Pretty Woman, or Oh Pretty Woman by Roy Orbison, and Pretty Woman by Two Live Crew. This is a case that reached the US Supreme Court and is really the best statement we have from the highest court in our country about what constitutes fair use in the context of a musical composition. Two Live Crew recorded a version of Pretty Woman that, not unexpectedly for Two Live Crew, included very bawdy takes on some of the lyrics of the underlying Roy Orbison song, which is a very sort of sweet, innocent, classic pop song about young love. and Two Live Crew kind of turned that on its head. And one of my favorite things about the court opinion is they saw fit to include all of the lyrics in the court opinion in an appendix. So we have these in the Supreme Court record. And the court basically said, in this case, in the musical composition case, what Two Live Crew did not require the permission of Roy Orbison's music publishers. It was a fair use. It was a commentary on or a critique of the underlying work. Now, there are lots of cases that say you cannot merely take someone else's song and add silly, dirty, funny lyrics to it and call it a fair use. But the court in this case went through a pretty detailed analysis and really kind of raised to the level of literary criticism these Two Live Crew lyrics and talked about the ways in which they commented on or critiqued, again, sort of the naivete and innocence of the underlying work in this song. So I flag that to say we have a pretty well-developed body of case law now going all the way up to the US Supreme Court about musical composition and fair use, particularly cases like this, which you would call parody. Parody is protected as fair use. Google Books, we have lots of developing case law around fair use in another context, which is what I would call sort of mass digitization. So the Google Books project, as you probably know, is a project by Google to scan the text of basically every book in the world, not for purposes of it giving me a full copy of the text of any one book, but for purposes of allowing excerpts from books to appear in search results. And publishers and authors got upset with Google after they launched the Google Books project, saying that's copyright infringement. Again, as we looked earlier, literary works, books, are protected by copyright. You've violated the right to reproduce and the right to distribute, therefore that's infringement. And the court said, no, that's not, that's fair use. It would otherwise be infringement, but Google is doing something radically transformative here. They've changed the purpose and character. The purpose and character of their use is very different from what a publisher does. When a publisher publishes a book, its purpose is for me to consume the book. When Google then copies that book, the purpose is to facilitate search. Also flag Google image search. When I do a Google image search for the word cat, these images come up. Each of these images is probably, to some extent, legally protectable as a matter of copyright law. And what Google has done here is made a copy of each of these images. So again, if I am the copyright owner in that picture, and Google has made a copy of it for purposes of delivering someone a small thumbnail of the image when they do their Google image search, the person who owns that copyright might be upset. In fact, there have been some cases about this, where this, effectively it was not a cat search. It happened to be a search for adult images. There's a company called Perfect 10 that seems to bring a lot of these kinds of cases. And their images were showing up in Google image search. They said, Google's copying my pictures without authorization. Court says, no, this is fair. This small, low-resolution thumbnail version of this picture is being presented for a very different purpose. And then the actual picture is, I can click through to that and get to the underlying picture. And so this is doing a productive social good. Google is enabling people to search for these images. That's a good thing. It's a fair use. In fine arts, we have seen a lot of movement on fair use, particularly around issues related to what I would call sort of appropriation art. Richard Prince, the image on the left is by a professional photographer named Cariou. Cariou went to Jamaica, took photographs of Rastafarians and put out a book. It was sort of a history or an ethnography of Rastafarian culture. Richard Prince, I don't know if people know Richard Prince's work, is sort of, some of us think that he exists solely to create interesting fair use cases. He's a very well-known, very prominent fine artist, has shown in the largest galleries and museums in the world, and much of what he does involves taking existing images and then recasting them and changing them in some way. He created a whole series of works based on Cariou's underlying images of Rastafarians, and the court said most of them, not all of them, but most of them are probably fair uses. Commercial photographers who take photos like the photo on the left are very upset about this, I will say. I've been on panels before talking about this case where you have commercial photographers who say this is precisely the kind of thing you should get a license for. You should pay me and get my permission to do this. Courts have been willing in the visual arts context to really push and to accept, I think, relatively expansive versions of fair use. This is another example. The band Green Day took this picture, which is a picture by a street artist, and used it as the backdrop for their live performance set. This was in one of their tours a few years ago. The court said that was fair use, did not require the permission of this underlying photographer. So I mentioned all of this to point out that whether it's musical compositions, fine art, mass digitization projects, search, that sort of thing, we're seeing a lot of action on the fair use front. The place we don't have a lot of decisions, which kind of surprises some people, is in sampling and mashups. We don't actually have a lot of case law yet about what is fair use when it comes to taking an existing sound recording, so it's like the composition sound recording, lifting out a few bars of it and looping it, which is a very prominent thing that happens all the time in popular music. Obviously, going back to particularly mid to late 80s, sort of the birth of hip-hop was all based around sort of sampling of other people's sound recordings. It surprises some people, I think, that we don't have a lot of case law on that. Why is that? There's a lot of reasons why that might be the case. We were talking earlier about the fact that there is actually an existing licensing market now for sound recording samples in hip-hop songs in particular. And in general, at the high level, very prominent artists sampling very prominent works, think kind of classic jazz recordings from Blue Note and that sort of thing. There's a relatively well-functioning market. People know you can get permission, you can pay, that sort of thing. And in some ways, we don't see the big players pushing the fair use arguments, perhaps because they don't want to get the answer that some of this might be fair use. If it were fair use, this might disrupt an existing licensing market. So that's one possibility. But as we see artists like Girl Talk in recent years, other artists who do a lot of very heavy sample-based music, it's only a matter of time before we get some more clarity on this issue. So I wanted to flag that for you. Second, statutory licensing regimes. Again, something that surprises some people, I think, when we talk about music licensing is the fact that we mentioned earlier all of those different bundles of rights and the permissions that are required to use works. In the US, a lot of that is left up to the free market. If I'm the owner of a sound recording and a musical composition, for example, and you're Michael Bay and you're making the next Transformers movie and you want a license from me, pure market negotiation. I can say yes, I can say no, I can say yes, but it'll cost you $1 million. Anything I want to say, it's up to the market. But in the US, we actually have significant numbers of licensing markets that are very heavily regulated. In some cases, actually, where the licenses are statutory, where you can't actually even say no, and the rates are set by statute. The most prominent one of those has to do with what's called the mechanical reproduction right. A lot of people think of this as the cover license. If I want to cover a song, as long as that song has been released to the world in the past, the songwriter of that song or his or her music publisher cannot tell me no. Because we have this system where we have judges who sit in an office at the Library of Congress in DC and every few years set statutory licensing rates. The current licensing rate for these kinds of covers, as I mentioned, is 9.1 cents per song. So if I go and cover your song, or I cover a Beatles song, or I cover anything else, and I release it on iTunes and it sells for 99 cents, no one can tell me no as long as I pay 9.1 cents of the money I get through to the copyright owner. This is one example. And again, it gets more complex when we talk about things that aren't actual sales or transfers, things like Spotify, streaming services. But anywhere a mechanical license is involved, which is this reproduction license for a song, we have a statutory regime that says as long as you jump through some hoops, you pay the money, no permissions required. We have, in the US, performing rights societies. You've probably heard of groups like ASCAP and BMI. These are organizations that govern not the reproduction of songs, but the public performance. This could include playing something over the air on a radio station. It would also include, frankly, if I picked up a guitar right here and began performing for you, that might be a public performance. It would be horrible. I would not recommend that you do that. But, and public performances are governed by these licensing societies. Songwriters sign up to be one of the members of these societies, and they grant blanket licenses. It would not surprise me if Simmons had a broad license to cover public performances on its campus. Some rate is paid, and then those are spread out among all different songwriters over time. This is not a statutory license, but we have, because of some malfeasance by the PROs back in the 1940s, we have the Southern District of New York, a federal court in New York, operates as a rate court, which means if I go to one of the PROs and ask for a license, and they say no, or they quote me a very bad rate, I can go to court and say these guys are behaving badly again, and the court has the ability to adjust the license rate that's been quoted. So it's another form of sort of regulation. I'll say one more. Sound recordings for use in things like what are called non-interactive streams. These are things like Pandora or Sirius XM radio. Non-interactive meaning I can't pick the song I want to hear, right? If I'm Spotify, you can pick the actual song. Non-interactive means I tell it what genre I like and it plays the music for me. As long as those services like Pandora pay an organization called Sound Exchange in Washington, D.C., they don't have to go to every record company and get that license. It's all set by statute. Again, the same 3 judges sitting in the Library of Congress set those rates every few years. And so I mentioned this just to say there is a huge discussion out there about what should and should not be covered by statutory licenses. People who own rights in works, I would say as a general rule, this is not going to apply across the board, but may be troubled by the existence of statutory licenses, because they may say, well, it deprives me of the ability to withhold from the market things that I own, or to set the rate. It also sets a one rate across the board. That 9.1 cent per unit rate applies whether we're talking about a Lennon-McCartney Beatles song or whether we're talking about the latest Miley Cyrus single. No offense to Miley Cyrus, but one might argue that if we let this up to the market, it would work out a little differently. On the flip side, for those who use works, again, at the volume we're talking about, Spotify, I think, has 35 million tracks today. In some ways, they might like a lot more of this kind of statutory licensing. They would prefer not to have to go to hundreds or thousands of different rights holders and get these rights. They would much prefer to have the certainty that comes along with statutory licensing. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more discussion about how much of this we want to happen by law versus how much of it we want to leave to the market. Really briefly, hot topic number 3 has to do with what's called the first sale doctrine in copyright. This is a copy of a book called The Castaway. It was an old Supreme Court case that decided that this legend inside the cover of the book The Castaway, which was sold in 1904, this legend says, the price of this book at retail is $1, and no dealer is licensed to sell it at a less price. So Bob Merrill's the publisher. Actually, Macy's department store was selling copies of this book. They were selling it for less than $1, and Bob Merrill says, you violated my copyright. I have the exclusive right to distribute it. I told you the terms on which I wanted it distributed, and you changed the price. And this case kind of stands for as the earliest and kind of clearest recitation of what's now called the first sale rule. The court says, no, you can't do this. Once you dispose of a copy of something that's copyrighted, anyone can do whatever they want with it. If I sell you a book, I'm a bookstore, I'm a publisher, you can read that book, you can lend it to your friend, you could light it on fire, you could sell it on eBay, right? I have no control. Once we've had that initial interaction, that initial sale of one copy of something, I can no longer control whatever you want to do with it, with that one copy. Now, obviously, you can't make more copies of it. That would be copyright infringement. But with that particular copy, you can do whatever you want with it. Interesting question. The language in the cases talks about how my rights in that work have been exhausted at that point. If I'm the publisher, once you have it, I have no more control with those off into the ether. Really interesting questions about how that applies in the digital world. And we had actually a company that was based here in Cambridge called Redigi that tried to launch a business model to say, we're going to apply that first sale doctrine, which is what allows used CD stores and used bookstores to exist, to digital files. So go to iTunes, buy songs, listen to them for as long as you want. When you're done with them, upload them to Redigi and we'll sell them used. And the court in this Redigi case said, no, that doesn't apply. You're not actually, in this case, selling the exact same copy that you purchased. You're making more copies of it. And Redigi went through all kinds of hoops to say, no, we make sure we scour their computer, we make sure they haven't made more copies of it. The court was very skeptical. But I mention this to say that we are more and more often these days locked into license agreements around our content, right? We are less and less frequently the owners of content the way we used to own physical books and other sort of media files. And I think courts in Europe and courts in the US have been wrestling a lot with this idea of how we apply first sale to digital goods. We're going to see a lot more action on this front. Number 4 of our Whirlwind Tour, the DMCA Safe Harbor, which some of you may have heard of. Vitally important piece of the Copyright Act, and sort of the easiest way to describe it is to think about a site like YouTube. What the DMCA Safe Harbor says is that if you're a site like YouTube or Vimeo, or really any site that takes user content, Flickr, Pinterest, Snapchat, Facebook, any site where users can put content on your service, you yourself are not liable for copyright infringement if your users upload copyrighted material. As long as, and there are some requirements, you have to jump through hoops. If a copyright owner comes along and says, take that down, you have to take it down. But in general, you are not responsible for your users' copyright infringements. This is vitally important. I mean, I don't think it's an understatement to say that the user-generated content web would not exist if the safe harbor didn't exist. Because if YouTube were liable for every piece of infringing content that someone uploaded to YouTube, and I forget every day you can check the statistic, about the number of thousands of hours every second that is uploaded to YouTube, YouTube would go out of business. It could not exist. Content owners might say, good, I would like for them to go out of business, because what the DMCA Safe Harbor does is it puts on the content owners the requirement that they go around and police this stuff. So they have to either automate it or hire a bunch of young lawyers or paralegals or trained monkeys or something to chase this stuff down one by one and go to every site on the internet and take it down. And take it down multiple times, right? If they take it down off YouTube today because they found one link to it, tomorrow they could come in and say, wait, there's 10 more copies of it. So it's sort of that whack-a-mole problem. The user-generated content sites say, well, wait a minute, without this we wouldn't be able to exist. If you're going to put liability on us for what our users do, we can't operate. And there's a ton of activity going on right now about the scope of the safe harbor, with the content owners really pushing hard for more of an obligation on the websites to police their content a little bit more proactively. And again, I think there's really important policy issues at play there. We're going to see that play out, I think, in the coming months. So the last one I'll flag is, I think, maybe the most interesting, and again, maybe interesting to folks around here who do library and information sciences, and I teach a class at the law school called Music and Digital Media. We kind of build to this topic, and I sometimes feel the students are disappointed. We've done all this really sexy, fun, fair use sampling, all of this kind of stuff, and then I say music rights registries and metadata, and everyone's like, oh my god. But I think, after we think about it for a little bit, people understand that it's actually vitally important and something I've been thinking about quite a lot. So, to state the obvious, we started with these two different types of works, musical compositions and sound recordings. Those can be used in myriad different ways by myriad different services, and the licensing landscape is extraordinarily complicated for a number of reasons. One is, obviously, as we talked about, if you're a licensee, if you want to use works, you need rights in two separate works, a song and a recording. You might need different kinds of rights with respect to each work. So for example, with a musical composition, you might need rights from one person, one party to copy it, and another party to publicly perform it. So you have to go to multiple rights holders to get those kinds of things. There are different means of establishing license terms, as we talked about. Some of them are up to the market, some of them are governed by these statutory regimes. There is an extraordinary number of licensors, typically music publishers and record labels, but many others. So you have to go to a lot of places. And you have to do this worldwide. So we've been talking mostly about the United States Copyright Act. Take everything I'm talking about here today and apply it to every country in the world differently, because copyright is territorial. And if you want to operate a worldwide service, you may have to do all of these negotiations separately in the US and France and the UK and that sort of thing. In 2015, the Copyright Office came out with this report, which has sort of become a textbook for people who teach in this area. It's interesting, called Copyright in the Music Marketplace. And in one of the appendices to that report, they kind of tried to map the universe, and this is what it looks like. And it's a mess. And if you have about 11 hours, we could walk through this. But in the musical work side, the song side, we have different rights for sync, which is use with film, reproduction, making copies, and public performance. And on the sound recording, we have all of these different types of rights as well. I'm not going to walk through this, although I'm happy to share this with you. This is actually one of the clearer maps I've ever seen of this world. But it's for people who are down here who want to make use of works, it creates a very, very complex situation. And again, that includes librarians and archivists, it includes commercial services like iTunes and Spotify. Navigating this is very, very difficult. This is a similar map that talks about how licenses get negotiated. As I mentioned, some of them are left up to the free market, some of them are subject to the Copyright Royalty Board in Washington, D.C., and some of them go to this rate court in federal court. Really complex, and in addition to all these substantive concerns, we have this overarching concern that there's really nowhere you can go to map this, to find this. Again, let's say right now we decided we're going to start the next Spotify and we need to license 35 million tracks. There's nowhere to go to find out who owns what, let alone to negotiate the rates that are subject to the market. The US Copyright Office does not perform that function. Private companies like Spotify and like some of these companies that pay royalties have gone out brute force over the years and amassed internal databases. I think there's a pretty compelling argument that at least the licensing data itself, if not the works obviously, but at least the data about where you need to go could be treated as more of a public good, and we could put this stuff in a place that would facilitate licensing. The fact that we don't have that database is not for lack of trying, and we could talk for a long time about the various efforts over the past decades to solve this. The World Intellectual Property Organization had a large effort called the International Music Registry that failed. The EU to put tens of millions of dollars into an effort in recent years called the Global Repertoire Database also failed. This is a particularly acute problem in Europe, where you have a great many countries in a relatively small geographic area. So again, if you have to negotiate separate rights in Germany and France and the UK and Italy. It gets particularly complex. They have a really strong interest in establishing what they call a digital single market for everybody. Has also been really difficult. Why is it so complex? I wish I had a good answer for you. I often say we had a workshop at the Berkman Center then a number of years ago, and my wife, who's a brilliant doctor but is not a lawyer and does not work on this stuff, said, "What are you doing today at work?" And I said, "Well, we're hosting a workshop with very smart people from all over the world coming in to talk about how it would be great if we built a registry or database that told people sort of canonical metadata about who owns what works." And she was sort of like, "You need to have a conference at Harvard Law School about that." It just seems like such a no-brainer when people kind of try and get into this space and say there's really nowhere you can go to find this information. Why is that the case? Well, one obvious place that could do this is the government, and due to various treaty obligations, the government, registering a work with your government is not typically a prerequisite to getting protection for that work. So typically the governments don't have a lot of leverage to say you have to come to us and register your work and put it into this canonical database. So the government's not quite positioned to do this. What about the licensors? I mean, it's always seemed to me like there was an argument that the content owners would benefit enormously from this kind of database. Again, you're telling the world, here's who you have to come to get rights. But the licensors say, first of all, this would cost a lot of money. It would require standardization across content owners. There's tons of mistrust and tons of, I think, a perception of the competitive value of just data about who owns what works. Again, that seems kind of surprising because you'd think this data, there's a strong interest in having it out there publicly for everyone to consume, but I think licensors feel competitive sensitivities about it. What about licensees, sort of the Spotifys of the world and the people who actually amassed some of this data? Again, they themselves, the people who've cracked this nut to at least some extent, have a real strong competitive advantage right now. If you were a digital service that has this figured out 90% of the way, Spotify is being sued now for mispaying mechanical royalties and that sort of thing, but they do this pretty well most of the time. Why would you want to go then open up your database, right, again, and invite competitors? So I will leave you with the idea that I think that this is a topic that has been kicking around for a very long time. And it's one that I think particularly because of the scale of music licensing and music rights complexity, particularly as we have digital services that are trying to do this, again, across tens of millions of tracks, I think the time has come that people are actually ready to begin focusing on it. I'll mention a couple of follow-ups to that. So this notion is that if we had a rights registry, a place that is the central location, that is has sort of accurate, comprehensible, accessible data, it's essential to the functioning of a licensing system. And in fact, that Copyright Office report I mentioned earlier kind of comes out and says this, and says there's widespread agreement that authoritative and comprehensive data related to identity and ownership of works would substantially enhance transparency, so this is sort of how royalties are paid and to whom, and also reduce transaction costs, that sort of thing. There's less harmony about how to achieve that goal, again, no kidding. So that's sort of why we are where we are. I will leave you with a note that there's an ongoing effort actually in the Boston area based over at the Berklee College of Music at their Institute for Creative Entrepreneurship called their Open Music Initiative, where they have pulled together a pretty impressive array, and this is probably a little bit out of date now, it's probably even more than that, a pretty impressive array of content owners and content users who have at least on paper committed to helping to solve this problem. Again, I think their frame is that at the end of the day, we want the maximum amount of revenue to go to the artists and songwriters, right? If I'm willing to pay $9.99 a month for Spotify, as much as humanly possible of that money should accurately, quickly go through to the artists and songwriters whose music I am consuming. And frankly, many of the organizations here are intermediary steps in that, each of whom takes a little bit of money out of the pot. So the more we can increase efficiencies around this, the better. I will also mention that there was at least one or two of the organizations that are part of this effort that have the word blockchain in their title. There's been a lot of talk about whether, and folks here know about sort of blockchain technologies, open distributed ledger technologies that serve as the backbone for digital currencies like Bitcoin, whether we might use those kinds of technologies to facilitate this. You could imagine a system where rights information that says if you use this track, you pay me and you pay this songwriter, could be publicly placed on a distributed ledger for everyone to open. And then again, if that were out there, you could imagine people building businesses or services on top of that public data. That's one of the many ways people I think are talking about solving these kinds of problems. I think I'll leave it there. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. That's Thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah, please, of course.
Let's say I have Beethoven.
What's that?
Let's say I have Beethoven.
Good, yeah.
And not copyright.
Yes.
But one version I have has no fingering.
Yeah,
The other
yeah.
one has fingering by Colin,
Yes.
and then transcribe all of this.
Right, right.
Is that breaking his copyright?
It could be. So there are, I kind of flippantly say Beethoven, Bach, public domain, but the underlying composition is certainly public domain, but there are things that you could do with a Beethoven or Bach piece of musical work in rendering the sheet music, aesthetic things, perhaps adding fingering, perhaps updating and creating your own arrangements of a piece. So here's a Bach piece that was written for piano, and I'm going to transcribe it for cello and flute. That arrangement might have copyright. So, and in those cases, you would have to separate out the uncopyrightable elements, which was the underlying musical work, clearly for both Bach and Beethoven, long in the public domain, from the added elements. Now, just adding fingering, I don't know, it would probably depend on the, again, I'll give you a classic lawyer answer, depends on the specifics of the situation, but I could imagine some cases where that might be incredibly valuable. It might have a lot of originality with someone who's gone and done that. Certainly a new arrangement could be a lot of sort of original expressive work in and of itself. That might be separately copyrightable. Yeah.
So then are places like Spotify being like, or back to the transparency you
Yeah,
was talking
right.
about, are they more of a, is it more helpful or is it more of a hindrance? I know they don't want to share their database because of
Right.
competition. I mean, there's a lot of special libraries that
Sure.
will
Right.
hire you if you have a library degree and then teach you when you get in because
Yes.
they don't want their competitors to
Right,
know.
right.
But like any business, like it could change or it could be gone one day and it could be left with the database, like what?
I
don't
think
know.
that the concern by legacy stakeholders, and in some ways this is sort of the theme of the music class I teach, there's lots of concerns of legacy stakeholders that they could be put out of business the more we use technology to manage this information. And again, if you think of the ideal situation is that I am a consumer of music and I'm willing to pay whatever I'm willing to pay to consume it. And at the other end of the chain, there's a songwriter and a person who made the sound recording. It would be, in an ideal world, we would eliminate as many intermediary steps from there as possible. And this kind of information management function is really a key function that the record labels and publishers and performance rights organizations and nowadays even the iTunes and Spotify's of the world have played. So the more we can kind of get people out of there extracting rents from different pieces of this system, the more of my money that can go to the songwriter and the sound recording owner. So I don't want to say Spotify specifically is thinking about it that way, but I do think that a lot of the intermediaries in this chain that really perform this function, they are there to help kind of manage the complexity, could imagine a situation where if all of this could be reduced to a bunch of entries on an open ledger on the blockchain, well then it puts them out of business. Yeah.
So, first of all, thank you so much
Yeah,
for
of
being
course,
here.
yeah.
It's really great, and it's a really wonderful presentation. So, a question about Creative Commons
Yeah, sure.
and the potential impact of
Yeah.
Creative Commons on the space.
Right.
I think in a number of our classes we teach about Creative
Yeah, it's great.
Commons. We also often encourage our students to think about how to think about embracing it versus letting
Sure.
go
Yep.
of our copyright. But I haven't actually spent much time looking at what the impact of that creativity
Sure.
in that space might be
Right.
in terms of just the broader
Yeah.
space in general. Have there been calculations or any kind of
Yeah,
economics or
Right.
analyses of sort
People-
or even just on a smaller scale?
Right.
What do we know about sort of the impacts of
Right.
in terms of music or
Yeah.
art, photography?
Yeah, I think, so there have been some people who've tried to study these kinds of things. I've seen some, every once in a while I'll see something that come across my feed that today was the 9 billionth Creative Commons license was executed or something. And people don't know Creative Commons is essentially, I put one of my works out there in the world. It could be a photograph, a piece of text, a piece of music, whatever it is. And I sort of pre-decide, anyone can use this for the following purposes. If you want to use it for a different kind of purpose, come contact me. So I think that Creative Commons in some ways emerged as a response to that horrible chart I put up on the screen, because the idea is that if we could create a subset of the content of the world that, again, the creators have predecided, predetermined that there's certain things they're happy to have people do with those works, then we don't have to wade into that mess. And so if and there are great libraries and databases out there now, this happens every day. If I do a blog post on our blog and I need an image for it, you can go to Google image search now and click a button, say search only Creative Commons licensed images. I don't have to worry about stepping on anyone's toes. Those images come up and you can use them. Again, I think that the short answer to your question is I think it's had an impact. It's had an impact not in some ways by solving that problem, but by working out something off to the side. But it's massive. I mean, the numbers of works out there that have that are currently licensed under Creative Commons is enormous, and increasingly numbers of tools that allow you to search. So for example, there's an organization we've done a lot of work with before called the Free Music Archive, based at WFMU radio station in New Jersey. Fantastic organization. You can go there and find tons of CC licensed music that you're allowed to use for all kinds of different purposes, and you can search by genre or style or artist, songwriter, that sort of thing. And never have to, again, wade into the morass. Now, what it doesn't do is if you want to use a Beatles recording for your film or something, you're not going to be able to do that. And I'm using Beatles as a stand-in for sort of any commercially licensed, commercially owned work. But I think there is, these days, a way to kind of avoid all of that mess if you can play around in the pool of existing CC licensed stuff. Yeah, please.
If you have digital music, or it's on a CD,
Yeah.
it's technologically very easy to embed all that data.
Yeah, absolutely.
in there and hide
Right.
it. You can watermark it, you can
Yeah.
give the contact, whatever.
Right.
So it will carry it with yourself.
Yeah, and the Open Music Initiative folks I mentioned, that's one of their ideas, is not just that you should have to go to a database and check, but that we could bundle together with a new file format. You know, the next wave of MP3 or whatever it turns out to be, a new file format that actually has the licensing data embedded in it, and could even, you know, in some ways, now we can get really kind of out there, but with these things like smart contracts, there's no reason why when I press play on Spotify and listen to a particular song, it couldn't trigger something in the royalty accounting department at Spotify to drop a fraction of a penny here and a fraction of a penny there. It could all be embedded, and you would, again, put out of business a lot of the people who have to actually move these pennies around. But again, I think if the end goal of this is putting more money in the hands of artists and songwriters, then it's not a bad thing. Great.
Well, that was very kind
Good.
of you.
Yeah, of course, thank you guys.